What if the greatest story Rob Reiner ever told was the one no one was meant to hear? Not on a screen, not in a script, not wrapped in laughter, romance, or courtroom speeches that made audiences cheer, but written quietly, slowly, in legal language, in decisions made late at night, in choices that would only reveal their true weight after he was gone. Because when the lights went out in that Los Angeles home, what remained wasn't just silence. It wasn't just grief. It wasn't even just questions. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It was money, a staggering amount of it. Enough to change lives. Enough to rewrite relationships. Enough to turn mourning into something far more complicated. And here's the question no one wants to ask out loud. Can a fortune be so large that it makes a family cry instead of heal? Rob Reiner spent more than 6 decades making people feel good. Laughing, crying, believing in love, believing in justice, believing that, in the end, things work out the way they're supposed to. But real life doesn't follow scripts. Real life doesn't cut to black when things get uncomfortable. And real life doesn't stop the clock just because someone was beloved. On the surface, Rob Reiner's life reads like a Hollywood fairy tale. A breakout role that defined an era. A seamless transition into directing. Films that became cultural landmarks. A production empire that quietly generated wealth long after the applause faded. From the outside, it looked like a perfect arc talent. Timing. Triumph. But here's the uncomfortable truth most fans never stop to consider. Success doesn't end when the credits roll. It lingers. It compounds. And sometimes, it creates problems no one prepared for. By the time Rob Reiner reached his later years, he wasn't just a filmmaker. He wasn't just a recognizable face. He was an institution, a brand, a walking catalog of intellectual property, residual checks, back-end deals, and ownership stakes that continued earning money while he slept. And while the public saw interviews, tributes, and nostalgic clips, something else was quietly taking shape behind the scenes. Paperwork, lawyers, trusts, decisions about who gets what and why. Ask yourself this. If you had built a fortune that could last generations, how would you divide it? Equally? Strategically? Emotionally? Would you reward loyalty? Independence? Need? Or would you try to control the future from beyond the grave? Because that's the part of inheritance no one talks about. It isn't just generosity. It's power. The final power someone ever gets to exercise. And power, even when well-intentioned, has consequences. When news broke that Rob Reiner and his wife had been found dead in their home, shock rippled outward instantly. Headlines moved fast. Speculation moved faster. And behind it all, a family was forced into the worst possible position, grieving privately while the world watched publicly. In moments like that, people expect unity, quiet strength, a dignified silence. But grief doesn't work that way. Grief is messy. Grief is emotional. And grief becomes even more complicated when it collides with something as cold and precise as money. Imagine this moment. A house that once echoed with conversation, laughter, arguments, everyday life, now silent. Phones ringing nonstop. Lawyers requesting meetings. Documents being retrieved from safes and filing cabinets. And somewhere in that chaos, a realization begins to surface. This isn't just about loss. This is about legacy. Because Rob Reiner didn't just leave memories behind. He left behind an estimated fortune of around $200 million. $200 million. Say that number out loud. Let it sit for a second. That's not just wealth. That's a system, a structure, a future mapped out in advance. And when money reaches that level, it stops being simple. It stops being, here's something to help you. It becomes, here's what I decided your life should look like. Some inheritances heal families. Others expose every crack that was already there. And the question isn't whether Rob Reiner loved his family. That's too easy. That's too simplistic. The real question is this. Did the way he chose to distribute his fortune bring people closer or push them further apart? Because the truth about wealth is uncomfortable. Money doesn't create problems. It reveals them. Resentments that were once manageable suddenly feel unbearable. Old comparisons resurface. Childhood dynamics replay themselves in adult form. Who was favored? Who struggled more? Who sacrificed? Who disappointed? Inheritance doesn't erase those questions. It amplifies them. And for a family tied to someone as famous as Rob Reiner, those dynamics don't play out in private. They play out under the weight of public expectation. People assume that money makes everything easier. But what if it does the opposite? What if it freezes people in place, trapping them in roles assigned decades earlier? What if it forces family members to relive old wounds while pretending everything is fine? And what if the fortune itself becomes a kind of accusation? As we move deeper into this story, you'll see how Rob Reiner's rise wasn't just a tale of talent and timing, but also one of control, vision, and long-term planning. You'll see how Hollywood success quietly reshapes family dynamics over decades, not overnight. You'll see how decisions made with logic can land with devastating emotional force. And you'll start to understand why this fortune didn't bring relief. It brought tears, because at the center of this story isn't a bank account. It's a question every parent, every creator, every ambitious person eventually faces. What do you leave behind when you're gone? Money is easy to count. Love is not. And when those two don't align, the fallout can last longer than any career. This isn't just the story of Rob Reiner's wealth. It's the story of what happens when a lifetime of success meets the raw vulnerability of loss. And as we step into the next chapter, one thing becomes clear. To understand why this fortune hurt so much, we first need to understand the man everyone thought they knew. Because the public image was only half the story, and the other half was quietly shaping everything. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. How does a man who made millions of people laugh leave behind a silence that feels this heavy? That question hangs in the air as we pick up from where everything fractured. Because before the fortune, before the paperwork, before the grief collided with legal language, there was a man the world believed it understood completely. And that belief was comforting. Rob Reiner wasn't just famous. He was familiar. He felt like someone you already knew. Someone who had been in your living room for decades. Someone whose voice, timing, and instincts felt reassuring in a way few Hollywood figures ever managed to achieve. That familiarity is important, because it shaped expectations. And expectations, when they collapse, hurt far more than ignorance ever does. Think about it. When people talk about tragic legacies, they usually picture chaos, scandal, excess, public meltdowns, loud warning signs. That wasn't Rob Reiner. His career didn't explode in controversy. It unfolded steadily, almost methodically, one success building on another, one chapter flowing cleanly into the next, which makes what came later feel even more unsettling. Because no one expects devastation from someone who seemed so stable. The first image most people have of him is Michael Meathead Stivic. Loud, opinionated, earnest to the point of irritation. A character who argued relentlessly at the dinner table and somehow still felt lovable. That role didn't just make Rob Reiner famous. It made him visible. It stamped his face into American culture during a time when television didn't fragment audiences the way it does now. Back then, millions watched the same thing at the same time. And Rob Reiner was right there in the middle of it. What most viewers never realized is how much that early exposure shaped the rest of his life. Fame that arrives early doesn't feel like a reward. It feels like a responsibility. A standard you're expected to maintain forever. And that pressure doesn't disappear when the show ends. It follows you. After his breakout success on All in the Family, Rob Reiner could have coasted. Plenty of actors do. He could have taken comfortable roles, collected checks, stayed recognizable. But that wasn't enough. There's a particular kind of ambition that doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't scream insecurity or desperation. It presents as curiosity, as vision, as wanting to understand how things work. That was Reiner. He didn't just want to be in the story. He wanted to shape it. So he stepped behind the camera. And this is where the public narrative gets almost myth-like. Because his transition from actor to director didn't just succeed. It thrived. Film after film landed. Not obscure passion projects. Not niche experiments. But stories that resonated across generations. Romance that felt sharp instead of sugary. Comedy that didn't talk down to its audience. Drama that balanced intellect with emotion. Each success reinforced the same idea. This man knows what people want. But here's the contradiction no one talks about. When someone becomes very good at understanding audiences, they don't always become better at understanding the people closest to them. In fact, sometimes the opposite happens. When your instincts are rewarded publicly, You start trusting them privately too. You start assuming your judgment is sound everywhere, not just on screen. And that's where cracks can form. Because family isn't an audience. Family doesn't clap at the end of an act. Family doesn't leave glowing reviews when the credits roll. Family remembers everything you forget. Behind the polished interviews and thoughtful public persona, Rob Reiner was also a man building something enormous. Not just artistically, but structurally. Production companies, ownership stakes, long-term deals that paid out not once, but again and again. Money that arrived whether he was working or not. Money that didn't feel like income anymore. It felt like gravity. Always there. Always pulling. As his influence grew, so did the distance between who he was publicly and how he operated privately. Not because he was hiding something scandalous, but because scale changes perspective. When you're young and struggling, decisions are personal, immediate, emotional. When you're powerful and wealthy, decisions become strategic, long-term, abstract. You stop thinking in days and months. You start thinking in decades. And when you think in decades, people can start to look like variables instead of individuals. Ask yourself honestly, have you ever made a decision that made sense logically but felt wrong emotionally? Now imagine making those decisions with hundreds of millions of dollars at stake. That's the version of Rob Reiner most people never saw. Not the smiling filmmaker, not the nostalgic TV icon, but the planner. The man who understood that wealth, left unmanaged, can destroy families just as easily as it can support them. So he planned, carefully, quietly, years before anyone imagined those plans would matter. Because here's the truth that's uncomfortable to admit. People who build empires don't leave their legacies to chance. They organize them. They structure them. They decide how much freedom the next generation should have, and how much guidance they think is necessary. And that's where love and control can start to blur. From the outside, everything looked calm. Interviews stayed thoughtful. Appearances stayed measured. There were no public feuds. No explosive tabloid moments. Which is exactly why the aftermath hit so hard. Because no one was prepared for the idea that beneath all that composure lay decisions capable of reopening wounds people thought had healed. And those wounds weren't new. They had been there for years. Buried under success. Smoothed over by time. Quieted by distance and routine. Until suddenly, they weren't quiet anymore. When Rob Reiner passed, the world mourned an artist. But his family mourned something else entirely. They mourned the version of him they thought they understood. And that's a different kind of grief. One that doesn't come with applause or tribute reels. It comes with questions. Why this? Why that? Why now? Why not us? Because when someone who seemed predictable leaves behind surprises, it forces everyone to re-examine the past. Every conversation, every decision, every moment that felt insignificant at the time. Was that a sign? Was this intentional? Did we miss something? And that's when the silence becomes unbearable. Because money doesn't answer questions. It just sits there, waiting to be interpreted, waiting to be argued over, waiting to be blamed. As we move forward, you'll see how Rob Reiner's transformation from beloved actor to powerful architect of wealth didn't happen overnight. You'll see how success layered itself slowly, almost invisibly, until it became something heavy enough to change the emotional temperature of an entire family. And you'll start to understand why the man everyone thought they knew might not have been the whole man at all. Because the public image was warm, but the private blueprint? That's where things get complicated. And once we step into how his empire truly took shape, one thing becomes unavoidable. The fortune didn't just appear. It was built with intention. And intentions, no matter how noble they start, don't always land the way we expect. But what came next would reveal how power quietly reshapes everything, and no one was ready for it. What happens when the role that makes you famous refuses to let you go? That's the question lurking beneath everything as we move forward. Because the public thinks they understand origin stories. They like them neat, inspirational, easy to retell in interviews and retrospectives. But real origin stories don't end when the spotlight hits. They echo, long after the applause fades. For Rob Reiner, that echo had a name, and everyone knew it. Meathead. The nickname alone tells you everything about how powerful the role was. Michael Stivic wasn't just a character. He was a symbol, a generational lightning rod, a walking argument who represented a changing America right there at the dinner table. Night after night, millions watched him clash with Archie Bunker, Old world versus new. Tradition versus progress. Certainty versus idealism. And Rob Reiner embodied that friction so convincingly that it blurred the line between actor and identity. Ask yourself something. If the entire country thinks they know who you are before you've fully figured it out yourself, how do you ever escape that version of you? Early fame doesn't give you time to experiment quietly. It doesn't let you fail privately. Every move becomes public. Every decision feels permanent. For a young actor, that can be intoxicating, but it can also be suffocating. Rob Reiner didn't just learn how to perform under pressure. He learned how to think strategically under it. Because when you become famous inside a cultural moment, you realize something very quickly. Relevance is fragile. Today's beloved character is tomorrow's punchline. And that fear doesn't disappear just because you're successful. In many cases, it intensifies. So instead of leaning further into acting, Reiner did something that surprised a lot of people. He stepped away from the spotlight and closer to control. Directing wasn't just a creative pivot. It was a structural one. Actors depend on opportunity. Directors create it. Actors wait for roles. Directors decide what stories get told. And for someone who had spent years being defined by a single character, that shift mattered deeply. Behind the camera, Rob Reiner wasn't meathead. He was the decision-maker, the tone-setter, the one people deferred to. That change rewires how you see the world. When you're acting, you react. When you're directing, you anticipate. You think in terms of outcomes. You ask what audiences will feel before they feel it. You design emotional responses. And once you get good at that, it doesn't stay on set. It follows you home. Film after film reinforced the same pattern. Reiner didn't just succeed. He succeeded consistently. That consistency is dangerous in a subtle way. Because inconsistency teaches humility. Consistency teaches confidence. And confidence, unchecked, can harden into certainty. As his directing career flourished, Rob Reiner became someone people trusted with big budgets, big casts, and big expectations. Studios trusted him. Actors trusted him. Audiences trusted him. And slowly, that trust extended into every part of his life. If your instincts keep proving correct professionally, why wouldn't you trust them personally? This is where the seeds of later conflict begin, not with malice, but with momentum. As Reiner's projects earned money long after their release, he learned a lesson most people never experience firsthand: the difference between income and wealth. Income comes and goes. Wealth stays. Wealth accumulates quietly, patiently, often invisibly. Residuals arrive whether you're thinking about them or not. Ownership stakes mature. Back-end deals blossom years after contracts are signed. Money stops being something you chase and starts being something you manage. And management changes people. It shifts conversations, alters priorities, introduces language that feels cold but necessary. Protection, planning, structure. You don't just think about yourself anymore. You think about what happens if you're not there. That's where estate planning begins to feel like responsibility instead of paranoia. And responsibility is often where misunderstandings are born. Because responsibility, when viewed from the outside, can look like control. While Rob Reiner was refining his public image as a thoughtful, socially engaged filmmaker, he was also becoming deeply familiar with the mechanics of legacy. Not just artistic legacy, financial legacy. Who owns what? Who benefits when? How assets are shielded? How disputes are prevented? Or so he believed. The irony is painful in hindsight. The more carefully you try to prevent conflict, the more likely it is that people will feel managed instead of trusted. But at the time, none of this felt ominous. It felt logical. It felt prudent. It felt like something a smart person does. And that's the contradiction at the heart of this chapter. Rob Reiner didn't become powerful overnight. He didn't wake up one day deciding to dictate the future. He became powerful slowly, incrementally, through a series of decisions that all made sense on their own. And because those decisions were successful, no one questioned the direction. Not publicly. Not privately. Not yet. As the years passed, Reiner's public persona matured alongside his wealth. He spoke thoughtfully about culture, politics, art, responsibility. To many, he represented a kind of Hollywood conscience. Measured, intelligent, principled. But here's the uncomfortable question that lingers beneath all of that. When someone becomes a moral authority in public, do they feel pressure to be flawless in private? And if they do, What happens when real life doesn't cooperate? Because families don't run on ideology. They run on emotion, on history, on remembered slights, and unspoken expectations. And money doesn't erase those things. It magnifies them. As Rob Reiner's empire expanded, his family wasn't just watching a career. They were living inside its gravitational pull. Opportunities came with expectations. Support came with strings, whether stated or not. Love existed, but it was layered with power. And power always changes the temperature of a room. By the time Reiner reached the later stages of his life, he wasn't just a storyteller. He was a planner, a man who believed deeply in shaping outcomes. And that belief would eventually extend to the one outcome no one escapes. What happens after you're gone? The tragic irony is this: the same instincts that made Rob Reiner successful as a director, anticipation, structure, emotional design, were the instincts he trusted when planning his legacy. He believed he could guide the story even after the final act. But families aren't films. They don't follow scripts. They don't accept endings just because someone planned them carefully. And when reality refuses to cooperate with intention, the fallout can be devastating. As we move into the next chapter, we'll look closely at how Rob Reiner's success transformed into something larger than fame. Something quieter. Something more powerful. The empire behind the curtain. Because once money starts working for you instead of the other way around, everything changes. And the choices made in that phase of life are the ones that echo the longest. But what came next would reveal just how much control can reshape relationships, and how difficult it is to let go. What if success doesn't just open doors, but quietly locks others behind you? That's the unsettling question that emerges as we step deeper into this story. Because by this point, Rob Reiner wasn't chasing validation anymore. He had it. In abundance. Awards, box office success, critical respect, industry trust. But success has a second phase no one prepares you for. The phase where it stops feeling like achievement and starts feeling like expectation. By the late stages of his directing career, Rob Reiner wasn't just making movies. He was delivering guarantees. Studios didn't see risk when they saw his name. They saw stability, predictability, a safe pair of hands. And that reputation is powerful, but it's also heavy. Because when everyone expects you to win, failure stops being an option you can explore creatively. It becomes something you must avoid strategically. This is where the mythology of Rob Reiner as the reliable hitmaker took hold. Romantic comedies that didn't age out. Dramas that stayed relevant. Stories that balanced humor with heart, intelligence with accessibility. Audiences trusted him to make them feel something without manipulation. And that trust translated directly into money. Not just upfront salaries, but back-end deals. Profit participation. Ownership. The kind of arrangements that don't just pay once, but quietly keep paying for decades. Here's something most people don't understand about Hollywood wealth. The biggest money doesn't come from working harder. It comes from owning pieces of things that keep working after you stop. Reiner understood that early. Every successful film wasn't just a creative win. It was an asset. Something that would live on television schedules, streaming platforms, DVD collections, syndication packages. Every time someone pressed play, a small signal moved through a system that eventually landed in his bank account. And those signals added up. Slowly at first, then relentlessly. At some point, money stops feeling like a reward and starts feeling like a background noise. Always present. Always accumulating. And when that happens, people start treating it differently. They stop asking what it can buy. They start asking what it can protect. Protection becomes the dominant theme of wealth at this level. Protecting assets. Protecting control. Protecting legacy. And legacy is where things start to get complicated. Because legacy isn't just about how you're remembered by the public. It's about how the people closest to you live with your decisions after you're gone. During this period, Rob Reiner wasn't just directing films. He was building systems, production structures, legal frameworks, financial pathways designed to endure. On paper, it all made sense. You don't leave something this big to chance. You don't trust the future to improvisation. You plan. But planning has an emotional cost. Because when you're the architect, everyone else becomes a beneficiary or a variable. And that shift, however subtle, changes how relationships feel. Imagine sitting at a family table knowing that one person's decisions will shape everyone's future long after they're gone. Even if that person loves you deeply, the imbalance is undeniable. It's not equal footing. And equality matters in families more than we admit. As Reiner's wealth grew, so did the invisible walls around it. Financial advisors replaced casual conversations. Estate planners entered the picture. Language shifted from personal to procedural. Trusts, structures, safeguards. These aren't words you associate with warmth. They're words you associate with caution. And caution, while sensible, can feel like distance. The irony is that Rob Reiner's films often celebrated connection, communication, understanding. Yet behind the scenes, his real-life story was becoming more compartmentalized. Not out of cruelty, out of responsibility. At least, that's how it felt at the time. And this is where contradictions become impossible to ignore. A man known for emotional storytelling begins making emotionally neutral decisions. A director praised for empathy starts prioritizing efficiency. A family man, admired publicly, starts thinking like a CEO privately. None of these changes happen overnight. They creep in. They disguise themselves as maturity, as wisdom, as doing the right thing. But the right thing on paper doesn't always feel right in the heart. As the years passed, Rob Reiner's name became synonymous with a particular brand of Hollywood credibility. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't chasing trends. And because of that, people trusted his judgment implicitly, including, it seems, himself. That self-trust is where the story turns. Because when you believe deeply in your own discernment, you stop inviting dissent. You stop asking hard questions. You stop wondering how your choices might feel to someone else. And family members rarely challenge someone who controls the foundation beneath their feet. Not because they're afraid, but because dependence complicates honesty. Would you tell the truth if it risked being misunderstood? Would you push back if it might look ungrateful? These are the silent negotiations that happen inside families shaped by wealth. And they don't explode. They accumulate, each unspoken thought stacking on the last. Each avoided conversation becoming heavier than the one before. From the outside, Rob Reiner's life looked balanced. From the inside, it was becoming structured, controlled, optimized. And optimization has a way of stripping away nuance. As his fortune grew, so did the temptation to ensure it would be used correctly. That word alone carries judgment. Correctly according to whom? Correctly for what purpose? Correctly for whose vision of the future? These are questions that don't get resolved when someone is alive and powerful. They get postponed until they can't be ignored anymore. As we approach the next chapter, the focus shifts away from the films and toward what those films quietly built. Because the real story isn't just about success. It's about scale. And once something reaches a certain scale, it stops belonging to one person emotionally, even if it still belongs to them legally. Rob Reiner's golden touch created more than entertainment. It created an empire. And empires, no matter how benevolent their founders believe them to be, leave complicated inheritances. As the money continued to grow, one thing became clear. This fortune wasn't just going to be shared. It was going to be managed. And management always implies oversight, rules, expectations, and consequences. But what came next would reveal how an empire built on storytelling began telling a very different story, one no script could soften. What if the real story was never on the screen at all? That's the question that takes shape as we move past the glow of box office numbers and into something far less visible. Because while audiences were watching characters fall in love, argue in courtrooms, and fight for justice, another story was unfolding quietly in the background. A story without applause, without interviews, without standing ovations. This was the story of ownership, and ownership changes everything. At a certain point in Hollywood, success stops being about individual projects and starts being about infrastructure. Who controls the rights? Who owns the library? Who benefits when something gets rediscovered by a new generation? Rob Reiner crossed that threshold without fanfare. One deal at a time. One contract clause here. One back-end percentage there. Nothing flashy. Nothing scandalous. Just accumulation. Think about how different that is from the public narrative. People imagine wealth as something loud. Mansions. Headlines. Excess. But real power doesn't announce itself. It consolidates. Reiner's most significant move wasn't just directing hit films. It was positioning himself on the side of the equation that keeps earning long after creativity slows. Production companies don't just make content. They own it. They license it. They repackage it. They monetize nostalgia. And nostalgia is one of the most reliable revenue streams in entertainment. Every rerun, every remake, every streaming deal, every anniversary re-release, all of it feeds the same engine. And that engine doesn't care whether the creator is alive or not. This is where the idea of an empire stops sounding exaggerated and starts feeling literal. Because an empire isn't defined by how loud it is. It's defined by how long it lasts. Behind closed doors, Rob Reiner was no longer thinking in terms of individual films. He was thinking in terms of catalogs, libraries, long-term value. He wasn't asking, what do I want to make next? He was asking, what will still matter in 20 years? That mindset shifts everything. It changes how you see money. It changes how you see time. And most importantly, it changes how you see people. When your work exists inside a structure that outlives you, you start believing that you can shape the future itself. Not emotionally, structurally. And that belief is seductive, because structure feels permanent. Emotions fade. Relationships evolve. But legal frameworks feel solid, reliable, immune to misunderstanding. Or so it seems. As the empire grew, so did the complexity around it. Multiple income streams, layered ownership, assets that couldn't simply be split the way a bank account can. You can't divide creative control evenly. You can't break up intellectual property without consequences. Someone has to decide, and that someone was Rob Reiner. Here's the contradiction most people miss. The more complicated a financial structure becomes, the more centralized decision-making gets. Even if the goal is fairness, even if the intention is protection, complexity demands control. And control, once established, is hard to relinquish. In family settings, this creates a subtle imbalance that rarely gets discussed openly. When one person holds the keys to the vault, conversations shift. People weigh their words more carefully. They hesitate before disagreeing. They wonder how honesty might be interpreted, not because they're manipulative, but because they're human. And humans adjust behavior based on power dynamics whether they want to or not. Over time, the empire behind the curtain became its own entity. Not malicious, not predatory, just present. A constant background force shaping decisions. Vacations, homes, education, opportunities. Money wasn't discussed as a problem, but it was always part of the equation. And that changes how love is expressed. Support becomes structured. Help comes with planning. Everything is organized, optimized, scheduled. From the outside, it looks responsible. From the inside, it can feel transactional. And here's the thing no one talks about. When wealth reaches this scale, people stop asking what it means emotionally. They start asking how to preserve it. Preservation becomes the priority. Not happiness, not spontaneity, not even connection. Preservation. That priority shows up in meetings with advisors, in late-night conversations with lawyers, in documents drafted, revised, and redrafted again. Each version promising clarity. Each version quietly introducing distance. By the time Rob Reiner entered the final chapter of his life, the empire was no longer something he actively built. It was something he maintained. And maintenance is about preventing damage, about minimizing risk, about controlling outcomes. That's where estate planning stops being theoretical and becomes urgent. What happens if something goes wrong? What happens if people fight? What happens if intentions are misunderstood? The irony is painful. The more you try to prevent conflict through structure, the more you invite it emotionally. Because structure doesn't account for grief. It doesn't adapt to shock. It doesn't soften its edges when people are vulnerable. It just executes. And when execution collides with mourning, the result is rarely peace. Rob Reiner likely believed he was doing the right thing. Most people at his level do. They believe clarity prevents chaos. They believe planning prevents pain. They believe that if everything is spelled out clearly enough, no one will feel hurt. But feelings don't follow instructions. They respond to perception, to expectation, to history. As the empire solidified, family members weren't just connected to Rob Reiner emotionally. They were connected to the systems he built. And systems don't bend easily. When he was alive, that rigidity was buffered by his presence. Questions could be asked. Adjustments could be made. Intentions could be explained. But once he was gone, only the structure remained. And structures don't explain themselves. They don't apologize. They don't clarify. They just stand there, waiting to be interpreted. This is where everything starts to tilt. Because interpretation is personal. One person sees protection. Another sees restriction. One sees generosity. Another sees judgment. And suddenly, the empire behind the curtain steps into the spotlight, not as a triumph, but as a source of confusion and pain and division. As we move into the next chapter, the focus shifts from how the empire was built to what it was worth. Not emotionally, financially. Because once numbers enter the conversation, everything accelerates. Expectations harden. Entitlement creeps in. Resentment sharpens. And the question stops being, what did he mean? It becomes, what do I deserve? But what came next would push those questions into territory no one was prepared for, and the numbers would change everything. What if the number itself was the shock? Not the death, not the silence, not even the unanswered questions, but the sheer scale of what was left behind. Because when people heard the figure, $200 million, it didn't just land. It echoed. It reverberated. It reshaped every conversation that followed. 200 million isn't just money. It's gravity. It pulls everything toward it. Emotions, assumptions, expectations, old memories that suddenly feel relevant again. And the moment that number surfaced, the story stopped being abstract. It became personal. Imagine this. You're still processing loss. Still replaying the last conversations. Still adjusting to the absence of someone who shaped your life in ways you're only beginning to understand. And then a number enters the room. Not whispered. Not gently introduced. Dropped. Heavy. Unavoidable. $200 million doesn't feel like a gift. It feels like a verdict. Because once wealth reaches that level, it forces comparisons. It invites measurement. It demands interpretation. Who gets what? Why that amount? What does it say about how he saw us? Money at this scale stops being neutral. It becomes symbolic. For some, it represents security. For others, recognition. For others still, validation they may have been chasing for decades without realizing it. And for a family already navigating grief, symbolism is dangerous. Because grief amplifies everything. A small slight feels enormous. A neutral decision feels deliberate. A practical choice feels personal. When the reality of the fortune settled in, it changed the emotional temperature instantly. This wasn't just about being taken care of. It was about what the numbers implied. $200 million means nothing was accidental. Every decision was deliberate. Every allocation reflected intent. Every omission felt loud. And that's when the quiet questions began to surface. Not spoken openly. Not yet. But present. Lingering. Why this structure? Why these conditions? Why now? People assume wealth simplifies things. It doesn't. It complicates them exponentially. Because wealth this large doesn't arrive in a single pile. It arrives fragmented, layered, tied up in systems and entities that don't translate easily into human emotion. There are assets that can't be divided without losing value. Interests that require oversight. Revenue streams that behave differently depending on who controls them. So the question stops being, how much is there? It becomes, who controls what? And control is where tension lives. As the scope of the fortune became clear, it forced everyone involved to confront something uncomfortable. This wasn't money meant to be spent freely. It was money meant to be stewarded. That distinction matters. Spending money is personal. Stewarding money is political. It introduces hierarchy, oversight, rules. Suddenly, inheritance stops feeling like inheritance and starts feeling like governance. Who decides how the money is used? Who has authority? Who is trusted? Who is supervised? These aren't questions families like to answer. But wealth at this scale demands answers. And the answers are rarely emotionally satisfying. Because stewardship implies judgment. It implies that some people are more capable, more responsible, more deserving of control than others. Even if no one says it out loud. Even if it's wrapped in language about protection and prudence. The message still lands. As details emerged, it became clear that this fortune wasn't designed for simplicity. It was designed for longevity. Trusts rather than lump sums. Structures rather than freedom. Conditions rather than blank checks. On paper, it looked responsible. In practice, it felt heavy. For some family members, it raised a troubling question. If he trusted us, why all the safeguards? That question alone can reopen wounds that have nothing to do with money. Because trust isn't just about finances. It's about belief. Belief in judgment. Belief in independence. Belief in maturity. And when wealth arrives wrapped in restrictions, it can feel like doubt disguised as care. This is where the emotional weight of the fortune became undeniable. It wasn't just about who received more or less. It was about how the distribution made people feel seen or unseen. Two people can receive the same amount of money and experience it completely differently, depending on context. One sees generosity. The other sees a ceiling. One sees opportunity. The other sees a reminder of past disappointments. And that's the danger of leaving behind enormous wealth without addressing the emotional narratives attached to it. Those narratives fill the silence. People start revisiting old moments through a new lens. That argument years ago, was it about values or control? That advice, was it guidance or judgment? That distance, was it circumstantial or intentional? Money becomes a translator of memory. And it's not a reliable one. As the fortune became the focal point, grief began to mutate. It didn't disappear. It transformed. Sadness mixed with confusion. Confusion mixed with resentment. Resentment mixed with guilt for feeling resentful at all. After all, who complains about inheriting wealth? That guilt is paralyzing because it silences honest emotion. It forces people to swallow feelings they don't know how to express without sounding ungrateful. But gratitude and pain aren't mutually exclusive. You can appreciate security and still mourn autonomy. You can value provision and still feel constrained by it. That contradiction is where many people find themselves when wealth arrives in the wake of loss. And for a family already under public scrutiny, those contradictions are harder to process openly. There's pressure to appear composed, unified, respectful, but internal experience rarely matches external performance. Behind closed doors, the conversations shift, not in accusations, not in shouting matches, at least not yet, but in careful phrasing, in questions asked indirectly, in silences where answers should be. $200 million changes the stakes. It forces people to confront realities they might have avoided forever otherwise. Are we equals here? Were we ever? Did success bring us together or quietly rank us? And perhaps the most painful question of all, did he understand how this would feel? That question doesn't come from entitlement. It comes from longing, from wanting to believe that love was present not just in intention, but in execution. As the scope of the fortune settled in, one truth became increasingly difficult to ignore. This money was not meant to disappear quickly. It was meant to endure, which means Rob Reiner wasn't just thinking about the present. He was thinking about generations. And generational thinking often clashes with individual experience. What benefits the family long-term can feel suffocating in the short term. What protects assets can restrict lives. What looks wise from a distance can feel cold up close. And this is where the tension truly crystallized. Because once people understand that the fortune is bigger than expected, they also realize something else. They are now part of a system they didn't design. A system that will outlast their grief, outlast their anger, outlast their explanations. And systems don't adapt to emotion. They enforce structure, which means the story stops being about money. It becomes about agency. Who gets to decide? Who gets to adapt? Who gets to interpret intent? And who is simply expected to accept it? As we move into the next chapter, that question becomes impossible to avoid. Because when wealth reaches this scale, it doesn't just provide comfort. It creates roles, managers, beneficiaries, observers. And once roles are assigned, relationships change. The family wasn't just inheriting money. They were inheriting positions. And not everyone would be comfortable with the one they were given. But what came next would reveal just how deeply those roles cut, and why the fortune itself became a source of division rather than relief. What if the hardest part of inheriting a fortune isn't the money, but realizing where you stand in the family story? That question begins to press in the moment the focus shifts away from numbers and toward people. Because money, for all its weight, is still abstract. Families are not. And Rob Reiner's family existed long before the fortune ever reached this scale. Long before the films. Long before the awards. Long before the empire. Which means the relationships didn't begin on equal footing. They began in childhood. They began in expectation. They began in patterns that were never meant to be examined under a microscope worth $200 million. From the outside, it's easy to assume that families connected to Hollywood legends live charmed lives. Privilege, opportunity, doors opening effortlessly. But inside those families, dynamics form the same way they do everywhere else, through time, temperament, and circumstance. Roles emerge early. The responsible one, the rebellious one, the sensitive one, the independent one. Those roles don't disappear just because success arrives. They harden. And when wealth enters the picture, those roles start to feel permanent. Rob Reiner didn't just grow into a public figure. He grew into a gravitational center. His career didn't merely support his family. It defined the environment around them. Schedules bent around his work. Conversations bent around his commitments. Decisions bent around his availability. That's not unusual. It's the reality of households built around ambition. But over decades, that reality shapes perception. Children don't just see success. They experience absence. Partners don't just see stability. They experience imbalance. And even when love is present, and it often is, the structure of the family changes. Success doesn't announce when it alters a relationship. It just does. As Rob Reiner's influence expanded, his family became connected to something larger than themselves. Not just emotionally, but symbolically. They weren't just relatives. They were part of the narrative. And narratives come with expectations. Be grateful. Be supportive. Be discreet. Those expectations don't need to be spoken to be felt. Over time, they shape how people express disagreement, how they ask for help, how they define independence. Because independence inside a wealthy family is complicated. When resources are abundant, choices feel less risky, but also less free. If you succeed, was it you or the safety net? If you fail, is it because you didn't try hard enough or because you didn't need to? Those questions linger quietly in families shaped by money. And they don't disappear just because someone passes away. In fact, they resurface with force. When Rob Reiner was alive, the family orbit revolved around him. Not in an oppressive way, in a natural one. He was the source, the provider, the decision-maker. Even if he never raised his voice, never asserted dominance overtly, the structure was clear. One person built the foundation. Everyone else lived on it. That doesn't mean resentment. It means reality. But reality becomes difficult when it's frozen in place. After his death, the structure remained, but the center was gone. And that's when questions turn inward. Who were we without him? What were we allowed to be? And what were we expected to be? Those questions don't have easy answers. Especially when money becomes the lens through which they're examined. As the family began confronting the details of the estate, old dynamics resurfaced in subtle ways. Not as shouting matches, not as dramatic confrontations, but as tone, as hesitation, as carefully chosen words that carried more meaning than intended. Someone would ask a question about a document. Another would answer cautiously. Silences would stretch longer than necessary, because everyone understood something instinctively. This wasn't just about inheritance. It was about identity. For years, family members had defined themselves in relation to Rob Reiner. As children, as partners, as supporters, as individuals navigating life under a very large shadow. Now, that shadow remained, but the man was gone. And shadows without sources are unsettling. Some family members found comfort in the structure he left behind. It felt familiar, stable, predictable. Others felt constrained by it. Like the past had been locked in place, leaving little room to renegotiate who they were allowed to become. Neither reaction is wrong. They're human. But when those reactions exist in the same room, tension is inevitable. This is where the myth of the unified family begins to crack. Unity requires shared interpretation, and interpretation varies wildly when grief is involved. One person may see the estate as a final act of care. Another may see it as an extension of control. One may feel grateful for protection. Another may feel diminished by oversight. And because no one wants to disrespect the dead, those feelings stay buried. At first, but buried feelings don't disappear. They wait. Family dynamics are built on memory. Not just shared experiences, but remembered meanings. Who felt supported? Who felt overlooked? Who felt trusted? Who felt managed? Money doesn't create those memories. It activates them. As conversations continued, something else became clear. This family wasn't arguing about amounts. They were wrestling with messages. What did this decision say about how he saw me? That question is devastatingly personal, because inheritance feels like evaluation, not officially, not legally, but emotionally. And emotional evaluations hurt more than financial ones ever could. The more the family tried to stay composed, the more the undercurrents intensified. Everyone wanted to do the right thing. But what is the right thing when grief and interpretation collide? Do you speak up and risk sounding ungrateful? Do you stay silent and carry resentment quietly? Do you accept structure to preserve peace or challenge it to preserve dignity? These are not theoretical dilemmas. They are lived ones, and they don't resolve quickly. Behind the public image of a respected Hollywood family, real people were confronting uncomfortable truths. They were discovering that love and power don't always align neatly. That provision doesn't guarantee understanding. That legacy can feel like a gift and a burden at the same time. And perhaps the most painful realization of all, that no one would ever be able to ask Rob Reiner what he truly meant. Intent died with him. All that remained were interpretations. And interpretations, once formed, are hard to reconcile. As the family navigated this new reality, they began to understand something quietly unsettling. The fortune wasn't just dividing assets. It was dividing perspectives. And once perspectives diverge, unity becomes fragile. Because families don't fracture over money. They fracture over meaning. As we move into the next chapter, the focus turns away from the family's internal struggle and towards something even more destabilizing. The moment when decisions made long ago finally surfaced in full. Because there's a difference between knowing a structure exists and reading the fine print. And when that fine print came into view, everything shifted. But what came next would expose how silence, once protective, became the most dangerous force of all, and no one was ready for what it revealed. What if the most important choices were the ones no one ever talked about? That question hangs heavy as this chapter begins, because by now the family understands something unsettling. The fortune wasn't assembled at the last minute. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't reactive. It was planned, quietly, methodically, over years. And silence was part of the design. When people imagine estate planning, they picture a single moment. A lawyer's office, a stack of papers, a signature at the bottom of a page. But that's not how it works at this level. At this level, estate planning is a process, an evolving document, a living structure that grows and adapts alongside wealth, relationships, and personal beliefs. Which means decisions weren't made once. They were revisited, revised, reconsidered, again and again. And every revision reflected a moment in time, a feeling, an assumption, a judgment. This is where the emotional weight of silence becomes unbearable. Because when people don't know why a decision was made, they fill the gaps themselves. And the human mind is rarely kind in those moments. Behind the scenes, Rob Reiner had spent years thinking about order. Not chaos. Order. He understood something many people don't realize until it's too late. Money left unmanaged can destroy families faster than money left unequally. So he organized. He structured. He tried to anticipate conflict before it happened. And in doing so, he made a critical choice. He chose not to explain everything. Not fully. Not openly. Perhaps because he believed explanations would cause anxiety. Perhaps because he assumed clarity would come later. Perhaps because he didn't want to invite debate. Or perhaps because he believed his intentions were obvious. But intentions are not self-executing. They require context. And context dies when the person who holds it disappears. As the family began reviewing the documents more closely, patterns emerged. Not shocking ones. Not outrageous ones. But deliberate ones. Protections layered on top of protections. Checks built into checks. Safeguards anticipating missteps that hadn't yet occurred. On paper, it looked responsible. Emotionally, it felt distant. And that distance sparked a quiet question that no one said out loud at first. What was he afraid of? Fear is rarely the word used in estate planning. People prefer prudence. They prefer foresight. They prefer responsibility. But fear and responsibility are not opposites. Often, they coexist. Fear of mismanagement. Fear of exploitation. Fear of regret. Fear of being remembered as careless. That fear doesn't mean a lack of love. It means a desire for control. And control, when exercised without explanation, feels like judgment. As each clause was read, family members found themselves translating legal language into emotional meaning. This clause protects assets, or does it limit autonomy? This structure ensures longevity, or does it imply distrust? This condition encourages responsibility, or does it punish independence? The documents didn't answer those questions. They couldn't, because documents don't speak. They enforce. And enforcement, without dialogue, feels cold. Here's the uncomfortable truth about silence. Silence feels neutral to the person choosing it. It feels intentional to the person receiving it. Rob Reiner may have believed that not discussing these decisions was a kindness, that sparing his family the complexity would spare them stress. But what silence actually did was defer the emotional impact to the worst possible moment. After loss, during grief, when resilience is lowest, the decisions weren't wrong. That's important to understand. They were thoughtful, structured, aligned with preserving wealth and preventing chaos. But they were incomplete, because they lacked emotional translation. They didn't answer the why. And when people don't know why, they assume motive. As the family sat with the reality of these choices, memories resurfaced. Conversations that now felt different in retrospect. Advice that suddenly sounded like instruction. Moments of distance that now felt intentional. Were these decisions the result of those moments? Or were those moments misunderstood all along? This is where silence becomes dangerous, because it allows the past to be rewritten emotionally. People begin to reinterpret history through the lens of the present. That's not manipulation. It's survival. The mind searches for coherence. It wants the story to make sense. And when someone can no longer clarify their choices, the story becomes collaborative. Each person fills in their own version. Some fill it with generosity, others with disappointment, some with trust, others with suspicion. And once those versions diverge, alignment becomes nearly impossible. As the days passed, the weight of these silent decisions began to settle. Not in dramatic confrontations, but in exhaustion. In conversations that circled the same questions without resolution. In the quiet realization that some answers would never come. There's a cruel irony here. Rob Reiner spent his life telling stories designed to resolve conflict, to clarify emotion, to give audiences a sense of closure. Yet his own story, at least for those closest to him, ended without explanation. Not because he didn't care, but because he believed structure would speak for him. And structure doesn't speak the language of grief. It speaks the language of permanence. As family members wrestled with this reality, another truth emerged. These decisions weren't just about money. They were about legacy, about shaping behavior from beyond the grave, about encouraging certain paths while discouraging others. That realization is destabilizing, because it forces a painful question. Was I trusted to choose my own path, or guided toward the one he preferred? That question doesn't have a clean answer. And the longer it goes unanswered, the heavier it becomes. Silence, once intended as protection, began to feel like abandonment. Not physical, emotional. A feeling that in the most critical moment, guidance had been withheld. And that feeling doesn't fade easily. It hardens. It calcifies. It becomes the foundation for future resentment. This is where the emotional stakes shift dramatically. The family isn't just reacting to what was decided. They're reacting to how it was decided. In silence, without dialogue, without reassurance, without the chance to ask, did you mean this the way it feels? As the realization settled in, something changed. Acceptance gave way to scrutiny. Trust gave way to analysis. Every clause was reread. Every condition re-examined. Not to challenge legality, but to understand intent. And intent, without explanation, becomes subjective. Each person saw a different story emerging from the same documents. And that divergence is dangerous, because once people stop sharing a narrative, unity fractures. As this chapter closes, one thing becomes painfully clear. The decisions themselves may have been made with care, but the silence surrounding them became the true source of pain. Because silence doesn't prevent conflict. It postpones it. And when it finally surfaces, it does so without restraint. As we move into the next chapter, that postponed conflict finally steps into the open. Because there is a moment when paperwork becomes personal, when legal language collides with raw emotion, when silence can no longer hold. And that moment arrives when grief meets the reality of execution. But what came next would transform quiet discomfort into something far more volatile. and no one was prepared for the consequences. What happens when the role that makes you famous refuses to let you go? That's the question lurking beneath everything as we move forward. Because the public thinks they understand origin stories. They like them neat, inspirational, easy to retell in interviews and retrospectives. But real origin stories don't end when the spotlight hits. They echo, long after the applause fades. For Rob Reiner, that echo had a name, and everyone knew it. Meathead. The nickname alone tells you everything about how powerful the role was. Michael Stivic wasn't just a character. He was a symbol, a generational lightning rod, a walking argument who represented a changing America right there at the dinner table. Night after night, millions watched him clash with Archie Bunker. Old world versus new. Tradition versus progress. Certainty versus idealism. And Rob Reiner embodied that friction so convincingly that it blurred the line between actor and identity. Ask yourself something. If the entire country thinks they know who you are before you've fully figured it out yourself, how do you ever escape that version of you? Early fame doesn't give you time to experiment quietly. It doesn't let you fail privately. Every move becomes public. Every decision feels permanent. For a young actor, that can be intoxicating, but it can also be suffocating. Rob Reiner didn't just learn how to perform under pressure. He learned how to think strategically under it. Because when you become famous inside a cultural moment, you realize something very quickly. Relevance is fragile. Today's beloved character is tomorrow's punchline. And that fear doesn't disappear just because you're successful. In many cases, it intensifies.